How are we recording in progress واحنا في الزوم بقى موجودة؟ I'd like to welcome you all into the session on gender in public policy. I want to thank the organizers of the conference for putting me on this session. I teach a course on gender in public policy, so I guess they thought that I'd be the right fit. I'm not sure about that, but we'll see. We have session of great presenters. Let me talk about every presenter in order. We start by Dr. Nihal. Dr. Nihal Hashim. Dr. Nihal Hashim is an assistant professor of political science at Faculty of Economics and Political Science, FEPS, Cairo University. She has a PhD in political science from Paris 1, and her doctoral thesis was on the socialization and politicization among Syrian refugees in France, case studies for a political sociology of exile. Dr. Nihal will present a paper on employment opportunities for refugees in Egypt between challenges of exile and socio-gender barriers. I am told every presenter has 12 minutes. C'est bon? Okay. 12 minutes. and c'est bon. And then we just take it from there. So the floor is yours, and I'll be keeping the time.
ستارت السيشن بالعربي. فطبعا بشكر دكتور غادة برسوم، وده بشكر دكتور ليلى البرادي، بشكر كل اي جي اي تيم ويو اس ايد. احنا النهارده بتكلم او قدمت بيبر عن اللجوء، ملف اللجوء في مصر وربطته بملف الجندر او النوع الاجتماعي. بالعنوان كان فرص عمل اللاجئات في مصر بين تحديات المنفى وقيود النوع الاجتماعي. الأجندة اللي هنتكلم عليها النهاردة هي مرتبطة بأربع أو خمس محاور رئيسية. المحور الأول هنتكلم عن السياق العام ليه اخترت التوبيك ده. هنتكلم عن المفاهيم وأهمهم مفهوم اللجوء، وبعدين هنتكلم عن تحديات اللجوء من ناحيتين، من ناحية الدولة ومن ناحية اللاجئات، وبنركز على الوضع الراهن بالنسبة للاجئات ومشاركتهم الاقتصادية، وبننهي بإن احنا بنحاول نقدم توصيات. الوضع بيقول في مصر إن قضية اللجوء قضية شائكة وقضية يعني sensitive شوية، علشان هي ليها ممكن دراستها من عديد من المنظور. في منظور الدولة، الحدود، الأمن الوطني، فدي perspective. وفي perspective تانية بتتكلم على حق الإنسان وحقوق البشر وحقوق الأفراد في إن هم يحصلوا على الحماية. فبيبقى في two perspective مختلفين قوي في القضية دي، فهي قضية اللجوء قضية شائكة. أضفت إليها منظور النوع الاجتماعي الجندر علشان يبقى منظور شوية محدود وشوية خاص. أنا بس بأكد إن أنا بدرس القضية النهاردة مش من ناحية الدولة والأمن الوطني، ولكن من ناحية الانديفيدوال، الناحية الخاصة بالفرد. وفقا للمفوضية السامية للأمم المتحدة، العدد الكلي في أغسطس 2024 وصل ل 793 ألف شخص طالب لجوء ولاجئ. وفقا لنفس المصدر المفوضية السامية، في 277 ألف أسرة لاجئة ومسجلة، منهم 50% من النساء و71% نسبة النساء والأطفال. على عكس الأرقام دي، المنظمة الدولية للهجرة بتقول في وجود 9 مليون مهاجر ولاجئ. ففي جاب رهيبة في الأرقام وفقا لاختلاف المصادر. من مصدر المنظمة الدولية للهجرة 9 مليون، والمفوضية السامية للأمم المتحدة لشؤون اللاجئين بتتكلم على 800 ألف، يعني حوالي 800 ألف. البروبلماتيك أو الإشكالية الرئيسية اللي ركزت عليها الدراسة كانت إلى أي مدى تعتمد الحكومة المصرية على سياسات عامة واستراتيجيات لتضمين النساء اللاجئات اقتصاديا وإدماجهن اجتماعيا. هنحاول نبين توصيات بعد كده، بس كانت أهمها إن إحنا لازم يبقى عندنا حصر الأعداد بطريقة دقيقة. تاني حاجة نتكلم إن إحنا إزاي نأهلهم عشان يبقوا مندمجين اقتصاديا في المجتمع المصري عن طريق التدريب والتعليم. ونقطة ثالثة رئيسية إن لازم يبقى عندنا قانون وطني موحد تقنين أوضاعهم داخل وفقا عشان كمان يقدروا يشاركوا بشكل مقنن وصريح. لو بدأنا بالتعريفات، طبعا عندنا مفاهيم كتير قوي. في مفهوم اللجوء، مفهوم الهجرة، في مفاهيم تانية مرتبطة باللجوء زي النازحين، النزوح القسري، عديم الجنسية. مفاهيم كتير، بس الدومين أو المفهوم الرئيسي اللي اعتمدنا عليه مفهوم اللاجئ وفقا لاتفاقية الأمم المتحدة لشؤون اللاجئين لعام 51. بتقول بشكل مختصر مين هو اللاجئ؟ هو كل شخص اضطر ان هو يخرج من بلده قسرا وفرارا من عامل مهم قوي وهو الاضطهاد. وده اللي بيفرق ما بين اللاجئ والمهاجر، ان هو نتيجة الشعور بالاضطهاد والخوف مسبب، سواء كانت هذه الاسباب يعني دينية اقتصادية سياسية اجتماعية، بس هي بالأخص سياسية. وبالتالي هيحتاج إلى إيه؟ هيحتاج إلى الحماية، حماية دولية أو حماية دولة بعيدة. حاجتين مهمين عايزة أقولهم في النقطة دي. النقطة الأولانية إن لما نيجي نصنف أو نحط كاتيجوريزاسيون أو تصنيف تحت مسمى لاجئ مهاجر، ده تصنيف لتأكيد حق وليس للتمييز أو كأداة لتهميش هذه الفئة من الأشخاص. النقطة الثانية إن اللجوء أو الارتباط بالمنفى أو دي عملية انتقال ليست جغرافية فقط، مش انتقال من بلد لبلد، ولكنها انتقال ليه بعد إنساني وليه بعد مرتبط بالحقوق. مش عايزين يعني ننسى النقطة دي، لأن أحيانا الموضوع ده بيبقى ليه صدى سلبي، كأنهم طبقات ممكن نتحكم فيها في أي وقت. ده بالنسبة للمفهوم. أوكي. آم، بالنسبة للتحديات اللي موجودة، طبعا احنا عارفين التحديات بالنسبة لمصر خصوصا بالأمن الوطني، وخصوصا العبء الاقتصادي اللي ممكن يمثله وجود أعداد كبيرة من اللاجئين. هنتكلم to the point على طول. فرص عمل اللاجئات أو مشاركتهم الاقتصادية، إيه التحديات اللي بيواجهوها وإيه السياسات اللي مصر عملتها من أجل إدماجهم اقتصاديا. بيتعرضوا لمزيد من التهميش، اللاجئات بمعنى أخص، لأنهم في تهميش مزدوج. أولا لأنهم نساء فمرتبطة بالنوع الاجتماعي، وبالنسبة للهوية بتاعتهم ودور أو وضعهم كلاجئين، فنساء لاجئات هوية مختلفة، ففي دوبل مارجيناليزاسيون أو تهميش مزدوج. ده طبعا بيأثر ان هم اكثر عرضة لمخاطر الاستغلال واكثر عرضة للتوظيف المؤقت وغير الرسمي. كان في ستادي تم الاعتماد على ستادي عملتها اليو ان اتش سي ار تحت مسمى سوسيو ايكونوميك بروفايلنج اوف ريفيوجيز. الدراسه دي اتعملت في مصر في 2023 2024 على عينه من اللاجئين الموجودين في مصر، عشان نشوف الاربع نقاط اللي احنا كنا بنتكلم عليها: التمييز، فرص العمل المحدوده، الحاجه الى الدعم، التهميش الاجتماعي والاقتصادي. احنا اعتمدنا على الدراسه دي عشان نوري ارقام معينه كمؤشر للسيتويشن او الوضع الراهن. الستادي دي سالت العينه من اللاجئين هل بتواجهوا بشكل دايركت يعني عنصريه او تمييز في مصر. كان 45% من اللاجئات قالوا ايوه، و37% من اللاجئين قالوا لا. ولو ما نيجي نقارن ما بين السؤال الاولاني والسؤال الثاني، برغم ان احنا لسه ما اتكلمناش عليه، فرص العمل المحدوده، هنلاقي ان نص الفرص اللي ممكن تبقى موجوده للنساء هي دوبل للرجال. فالرجاله ممكن يصلوا الى 55% من الفرص العمل المحدوده، نصهم بتصل اليهم النساء. وبرغم النسبه المعطيه الاقل دي، الا ان احنا لما نيجي نتكلم على بواجه عنصريه، النساء بتواجه عنصريه الدوبل، بتواجه اكتر يعني تمييز عنصري اكتر من الرجال بمعدل الدوبل. وليس فقط الموضوع مش مرتبط بس بالبيئه العمل يعني. النقطة دي برضو نقطة مهمة قوي، إن نسبة البطالة بالنسبة للستات أو النساء اللاجئات في مصر تعدل 27%، على عكس مقارنة بالرجال نسبة البطالة بتصل إلى 18% من اللاجئين بس بالنسبة لسوق العمل. بنأكد برضو بالنسبة لسوق العمل ووجود اللاجئين إن سواسية الاثنين محتاجين موارد ودعم من الدولة بشكل بارتيكولير أو بشكل خاص علشان نحسن من وضعهم. وجود فرص عمل مناسبة ممكن كانت تبقى تصل إلى 18% بالنسبة للنساء، على عكس الرجال اللاجئين بيصلوا ل 32%. بس كلهم وفقا للأسئلة اللي اتسألت لهم محتاجين لمزيد من التعليم والتدريب عشان يقدروا يحسنوا من مهاراتهم، يقدروا يتقنوا اللغة، لأن معظمهم مش من مصادر اللغة، مش منتمين لأصول عربية، فاللغة عاملة لهم حاجز. على عكس كمان بالإضافة إلى احتياجهم للتدريبات والتعليم والصحة. ده كان بعد برضو بيأكد لي إن في درجة من التهميش أو درجة من التمييز. لما جم الستادي سالتهم على الاسئله دي، حسن المعامله ومصر وكده، معظم الإجابات كانت من الأصول الغير عربية، اللاجئين من أصول غير عربية كان عندهم نسبة من التهميش أكتر من اللاجئين من أصول عربية نتيجة اللغة طبعا زي ما احنا عارفين. مصر عملت ايه للرد على السؤال او الاشكاليه الرئيسيه للدراسه؟ مصر عملت ايه كانجازات او كمحاوله لايجاد حلول لهذه المشاكل الموجوده الخاصه باللاجئين؟ كان في كذا مبادره غير انها ملتزمه بالاطر القانونيه اللي احنا عارفينها كلنا، الاتفاقات الدوليه المختلفه. عملت في برنامج اسمه برنامج القيادة والتمكين والوصول والحماية ليب، كان 2016. ده كان بيركز على اللي احنا بنتكلم عليه، مزيد من التدريب المهني، مزيد من التعليم، مزيد من الوعي بمخاطر النساء والنوع الاجتماعي. في برضو منصة مشتركة كآلية للتواصل والتفاعل ما بين كل الستيك هولدرز المرتبطين بهذه القضية لمزيد من الشفافية ومزيد من العمل للوصول للفرص والخدمات. آخر حاجة كانت 2024، كان في مشروع قانون كان بيتناقش في البرلمان عن إن إحنا عايزين نعمل قانون وطني داخل جوه مصر يناقش ويحدد ويحل اللاجئين بشكل داخلي وليس فقط عن طريق المفوضية السامية للأمم المتحدة. وكانوا عايزين يعملوا لجنة خاصة تبع رئاسة الوزراء هي اللي بتستقبل طلبات اللجوء وتحدد مين اللي يستحق ومين اللي لا يستحق، وعلى أساسها ينظم أمورهم كلهم بشكل وطني داخلي حفاظا على الأمن الوطني. كتوصيات مقترحة عشان أنهي البيبر بتاعتي، المفروض نعمل إيه؟ نحل الموضوع ده إزاي؟ أول حاجة زي ما قلت في الأول، تباين كبير ما بين الأعداد، إن إحنا مش عارفين مين داخل بشكل رسمي مين داخل بشكل غير رسمي. المفوضية السامية ادت ورق لمين وإزاي ووفقا لإيه. عشان ننظم العملية دي كلها، أول حاجة لازم بيانات دقيقة تعتمد عليها الدولة عشان نشوف هنحلها إزاي. يبقى أول حاجة تنظيم اللجوء وتنسيق السياسات الخاصة بالموضوع ده عن طريق بيانات دقيقة. تاني حاجة، كل ما له علاقة بسوق العمل والمشاركة الاقتصادية نسهل لهم شوية، لأن المواضيع صعبة جدا في الحصول على تراخيص العمل والحصول على الإقامة والورق كله. وبالتالي ان احنا تفعيل بقى القانون اللي موجود في البرلمان دلوقتي، ونشجع اكتر على المشاركه عن طريق مشاريع زي رياده الاعمال او ال 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 حاضر اوكي. هنهي بالموضوع ده ان التواصل مع المجتمع والتخطيط الاساسي معلومات. نعمل بقى يعني دراسات طوليه على طولة المدى لدراسه هذه القضيه من مختلف الابعاد بشكل شامل، لا يخل بالامن الوطني ولا يخل بحقوق اللاجئين. ثانك يو. ميرسي.
شكرا دكتور نهال، عرض وافي ورائع. دلوقتي أنا معادي أقدم زميلاتي دكتورة ليلى البرادعي ودكتورة رنا هندي. دكتور لا، خلي كل الأسئلة كلها مرة واحدة في الآخر عشان نقدر بس نظبط الوقت أحسن. حد قدمك قبل كده throughout الكونفرنس ده؟ كلمتي كتير بس حد قال مين ليلى البرادعي؟ لا يعني لا، خليني introduce you. يعني حصل ولا ما حصلش؟ تقليش throughout you introduce yourself. طيب بقدم دكتور رنا هندي. رنا هندي is our colleague. دكتور رنا هندي is assistant professor of economics and public policy at our department, public policy administration department. She's also a research fellow at the Economic Research Forum, where she served as the thematic director for equity and inequality, as well as for gender-related projects between 2012 and 2014. She's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs since 2022.
Anymore. Not anymore. It's okay. That's more than enough. Okay, thank you so much for this introduction. It's sad, but always in gender related sessions, it's always a gender balanced panel, as you can see here, but it's always the case. So yeah, but we have an audience, alhamdulillah. Okay, great. So I'm very excited to present this paper that I'm writing together with Professor Laila Al-Baradei and Dr. Nohal Mikewi. So this is an idea that we got more than a year and a half ago to write about women working in the public service in Egypt. Of course, in a context of changing social contract, and that's what lots of panelists have been talking about for the past 2 days. So the motivation here is that the public sector has been the primary employer, especially for women, in the case of Egypt, especially for educated women, and that used to be the social contract. So every individual with a university who is a university graduate was guaranteed a job, a lifetime job, actually, in the public sector. Many countries, including Egypt, have seen a decrease in the public sector hiring over the past years, and that's the changing social contract we're talking about. And that all started in the beginning of the 90s with the implementation of the structural adjustment programs and the privatization. And then lots of women have moved to the private sector, but the private sector wasn't and still not able to create enough jobs that are, good for women. And we'll talk more about that later. What is a job that is considered good for women? Public sector jobs are especially appealing to educated married women due to the work-life balance. So this is just to give you some context. So this is female labor force participation in Egypt over, the 90s and till date. This is coming from the World Bank data bank. And you can see, it has been quite stagnant over the years with an average of 25, 26%, which is relatively low. And what is interesting is this sharp decrease in female labor force participation since 2017. So this decline, we can claim that it's at least partly due to the withdrawal of married women from the workforce because of the lack and the decreasing opportunities, fewer and fewer opportunities in the public sector in Egypt for women. So this is just to show you using some data what I'm talking about here. So this is the share of females employment in the public sector in Egypt, and you can see that it has been sharply going down since the 90s. Okay, so just for those who are not familiar with the Egyptian public sector, that is employing over 6 million employees. Employees may work, and we talk a lot about that in the paper. We have a whole section describing the types of contracts that are offered by the public sector in Egypt. Some of them are tenured positions, some of them are on contractual basis, and also this system of i'ara, which we talk a lot about. So, of course, it includes not only traditional ministries and specialized government authorities with different regulations and salary scale. Of course, one of the main issues the public sector in Egypt is facing is overstaffing. And of course, Kawa and the presentation that happened yesterday in the morning, it provided a lot of information about the issue. So what we do here, which is what I'm here to talk about, is we're trying to look at women in this sector, specifically in a rapidly changing context. So we borrowed the title of this paper from this famous movie, What Women Want. And that was the idea of Dr. Laila, so I give you credit for that. And we run a qualitative approach, and I was super excited to be part of this because I'm not a qualitative researcher by training, but it was so interesting, to move from a lot of data and numbers to a lot of long interviews, listening to those women working in different organizations within the public sector and hearing their thoughts and their experiences and the challenges they are facing and their aspirations, which is also part of the interview we're running. So be very quick because Dr. Ghada, I'm sure she will not give me any single additional minute. So I'll skip that, but just to tell you that many of those are already in the room who wrote about women in public service, who have been facing lots of challenges, not only in Egypt and the region, but also, here you can see the US and Russia and many other countries. So I'll skip that. Our conceptual framework is the social contract, and we focus specifically, so was this paper that has talked about the 3 Ps of the social contracts, which is protection, provision, and participation. Here, what we focus on is the gendered social contract. So basically, the idea here is we have the government and we have those women working in this sector. So the government is supposed to give fair compensation, security, benefits, lots of benefits, especially in Egypt, and in return is expecting productivity and commitment from those women. I want to take this opportunity to advertise for another paper we're currently working on the intergenerational differences when it comes to commitment to work for women working in the public sector, which is also very interesting. So, as I mentioned, it's a qualitative study. We're running interviews with 20 junior to mid-career women employees in the public service. Average age is 35. Some of them are single, some are married, some are divorced, working in 11 different sectors. I'll give you an idea about what those sectors are. So we had interviewees from, oh my God, from Ministry of Health, so many different sectors. We had from the Central Bank of Egypt, from universities, so academics are also represented here. So just very quickly, we ask questions related again to challenges, aspirations, and so on. We got the IRB from AUC that, so we ensure that we are taking care of all the ethical concerns. So I'll give to Dr. Hai.
It's a lengthy study, but the findings, are interesting. One of the main findings, unexpected, was that there was lack of homogeneity in human resources practices across government sectors, although all the time we're talking about how we're offering homogeneous and using homogeneous human resources tools in all government agencies. In reality, we realized that this is not the case. And then we're skimming through perceptions of women's benefits and challenges related to their work in the public sector. What do they perceive as an opportunity, something that they value, and what are the challenges that they face? And we link that with reflections related to the conceptual framework, the contractual, social contract. All right, the lack of homogeneity in human resources practice was manifested in various aspects of human resources management related to hiring. So different government organizations hire differently. Ministry of Planning, they go with the traditional hiring process. They get the applicants to sit for exams. This is not the case, for example, in the medical sector or pharmaceutical sectors, where they get appointed right away upon graduation. It's a taklif, just obligatory, more or less, assignment for work. In government think tanks, we heard of something new to us, short-term contracts, 3 months duration, not even 1 year duration, but they may be just for 3 months, which is something completely new. In the judiciary, of course, it's a different system also for hiring. It's not just the GPA, but a lot of security clearances, a lot of checks on social status and connections before they get to be hired in the judiciary. Compensation also differs. So those who are working in the newly developed government agencies, like, for example, the Food Safety Authority, they get double what others get at the Ministry of Health. The performance appraisal systems are different. So, for example, Ms. Mida, it's an annual appraisal system that the women perceived as biased. In MCIT, everyone gets a full score and they just fill in the papers. No one takes it seriously at all. Promotion, in some agencies, they haven't been promoted for a number of years. In other sectors, it's just, again, the traditional way based on years of service. What do women like about the government job? They like a lot, basically, again, the stability and security and the knowledge gain. They talked about working in government and how they get exposed to the kitchen and they figure out how things happen. And then they'll use this to move on to other positions, maybe in international organizations. They talked about family-friendly policies, and they are very friendly. So it's not just 6-year option for childcare leave, but it's an open leave for accompanying the spouse if there is a need to accompany the spouse and they still manage to keep their position. Right, and the prestige and perks perceived, there are still some perceived perks when they're working in the judiciary or as cultural attaché, but there are a lot of challenges as well. The compensation is the main challenge. The currency devaluation impact, we heard very, I don't know, sad stories about how they're impacted. Taking the kids to the club, they can no longer have lunch together. They're just giving instructions to the kids on Fridays to order a drink because they cannot pay anymore for the lunch if they want to buy a durable product. All right, I'll take one more minute. They need to do a lot of thinking about it and deliberations. They are subjected to harassment at the workplace, sometimes explicit, right? Inappropriate remarks from colleagues and sometimes less explicit. The facilities are sometimes insensitive to gender. In traditional workplaces, they talked about not having a toilet specified even for females. At the new administrative capital, there's only one child care facility nursery, and it's quite expensive. Lack of technology sometimes, physical work environment, public universities, we share desks and offices, quite a good number of faculty or teaching assistants share office space. Their aspirations, what they're looking for, definitely better compensation. We can talk again with Dr. Saleh al-Sheikh, code of ethics review to make sure that they address discrimination more clearly, anti-harassment procedures, better physical work environment, better pay and work environment, more flexibility and opportunities abroad. I'm considering moving to the private sector, then returning later to government, and desire for more voice and freedom. And this is from those working in universities, public universities. They're calling for voice, and one described it as a cemetery, the workplace. Our tongues are cut. I want to breathe. I must travel again to regain my voice. This is usually in public universities. There are a lot of interesting quotes. We don't have time to go through them, but the quotes are more telling than anything else. The conclusion is that the government's decreasing financial support and the devaluation, it's making it very hard for women to maintain their standards of living. The lack of homogeneity, the discrepancies in many of the human resources management tools and need to be addressed. Job security is weakening. It's no longer tenure at all, no longer even extended one-year contracts that get renewed, but to the extent that they're offering 3 months contracts. Harassment is still an issue. And women are still there sticking to what they can do, and they still value, despite everything that we've mentioned here, they still value their job in government. They've referred to it as a spare job, as their perceived sense of security, and they still want to get hired in government for that reason, the security and the stability, prestige, and it's more valuable than anything else. Thank you very much. And this was a very brief presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Laila. Thank you, Rana. I'd like to introduce Ms. Laila Al-Mushnib, our dear friend, as a former colleague actually here at AUC at GAP. Laila currently serves as the Gender and Social Inclusion Advisor for the USAID funded economic governance activity. She is a development expert with over 20 years of experience. Her career spans international donor organizations, government, higher education institutions, that is us, reflecting a commitment to advancing global development agendas. She worked with SIDA in Kuwait. She worked with, she sort of served as an international consultant supporting the Women's Research and Studies Center at Kuwait University. She also served as assistant dean here at GAP. I think it's a very long. I'll just stop here. Lovely to have you, Dalia. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gheda. The topic that we will be discussing today is gender responsive procurement. And actually, it's a new topic. It's an emerging topic globally, not only in a specific region. The paper that I presented is trying to explore more into this new concept or practice and trying to show how it can be used, procurement can be used as a strategic tool to help in the empowerment of women and to support women-owned and women-led enterprises and gender-responsive enterprises. For the coming 10 or 12 minutes, this is what we will be doing. I'll be showing you like the conceptual framework for the paper. We'll go through global experiences in gender-responsive public procurement, and I have taken cases from Latin America, the EU, and Africa. And then finally, we will end with a blueprint for implementation. Okay, first of all, when we tried to look at gender responsive procurement, we went back a step and we included, or I included, the definition of public procurement. But the most important thing is that procurement constitutes really a significant portion of GDP in different countries. It ranges between 12 to 20%, depending on the country, which is very significant. And also it is important to note the change or the evolution in the concept of procurement. So procurement in recent years changed. It's no more just an operational process. It doesn't only focus on compliance. It has been used recently as a socio-economic tool, and a lot of international organizations keep promoting for this idea. The sad thing, or maybe why we are looking at the gender responsive public procurement, is that only 1% of public procurement spending goes to women-owned and women-led enterprises. So there's a lot of missed opportunity here. To define gender responsive public procurement, the different sources had different definitions. But maybe most of them or all of them, they just agree that it is used to leverage procurement processes to promote for gender equality. The focus differs depending on the definition of each institution, but we have three types of institutions. We have gender responsive procurement that focuses on buying from women-owned businesses, or buying from women-led businesses, or buying from gender-responsive enterprises. And here, there is a difference, maybe in the Q&As I can answer that, between women-owned businesses and women-led enterprises. And we have the challenge actually in defining women-owned businesses, because the definition changes even from one country to the other. So we have just to keep note of that as we go along in the presentation. In my presentation, I prefer the definition that inclusive of all three categories, and not just the one that focuses on women-owned or women-led enterprises. Again, we can talk more about that in the Q&As. Again, if we look at gender-responsive procurement, we see that it aligns with all the international agreements, it supports inclusion, and it calls for broader social benefits, and it is a strategic use of government spending, and hence it is important for us to start looking at this process or tools. After finishing the conceptual framework, let's take a look at the different countries and how they apply it. And let me say here that the reason I opted for using different countries and different regions is that the topic is still new and there is not a lot of literature on that. Maybe the literature that exists is mostly focused on country experiences and it is mostly done by international organizations. I looked at Latin America, the EU, and Africa, trying to look at different regions and see how GRP would work in different socioeconomic contexts and what are the different approaches in the different countries. I will not go through everything. Maybe I'll just highlight the best practice from each country. When I looked at the different countries, what I did is that I tried to identify the key features of a GRP system. And the key features are having a responsible body, a legislative framework, certification, system for women-owned businesses, digital platform for procurement transactions, and capacity building. So these 5 features, 5 features, I take them along across all country presentations. If we look at Chile, we will find that Chile, the most significant aspect of it is the certification system, the Women's Business Seal, which Argentina followed as well. And the importance of having a certification is that it is not always easy to identify what is a women-owned business or what is a women-led business. So it is very important to have this certificate whereby procurement even officials can know how to reach them. If you do not know who they are or you cannot describe them, then you will never be able to reach this category. So this certification makes it very clear that this business is owned by a woman or led by a woman. Colombia, maybe the thing that is very specific about Colombia is the digital platform. And the reason is every one of these countries have a digital platform, but maybe Colombia is very specific because they do collect gender disaggregated data from this system and they have a dashboard that shows live information. And I would say that this is very important because if you cannot measure anything, then you cannot measure its impact and you cannot know how you are progressing towards achieving your goal. So having sex disaggregated data is a very specific feature of Colombia. The Dominican Republic, maybe I didn't include that in the paper, but the Dominican Republic in 2012, I guess, they had a female who was head of public procurement. And it is by her that all the initiatives that target women-owned and women-led businesses started and all the activities on gender-responsive procurement started. So this is the argument when we say bring in more women in leadership so that you have diverse views. Argentina, what was very specific about their capacity development activities is that they collaborate with civil society and the private sector. Again, this is a distinct feature of the capacity building activities in Argentina, bringing in the civil society. We're halfway through. Bringing in civil society and private sector to provide the training and to create awareness about this. All of them, they have a very good legislative framework. It is there in all the countries, and the capacity building here focuses more on women-led enterprises and women-owned enterprises. This is the target audience for the capacity building. Okay, in the EU, Spain is really like an example for a country that has a very advanced ecosystem for gender-responsive public procurement. The legislation is very strong. They have gender clauses in contracts. Actually, those clauses are mandatory in contracts. They have an integrated system for compliance monitoring, again, data and generation of data. Austria is also very strong, maybe not the leading in Europe like Spain, but because Spain is actually the leading country in Europe, but they also, maybe their approach emphasizes the need to have like catered or customized approaches to different regions. And let me say here, maybe some other thing that's very specific about Spain is that they engage gender equality bodies within the country. These are autonomous bodies who actually provide tools and guidelines and guidebooks on how to do gender responsive procurement. The capacity building here is very also specific because they train not only the women entrepreneurs, but they also train procurement officials on how to integrate gender across the procurement cycle. Okay, in Africa, Kenya is one of the very first countries to adopt gender responsive procurement. The legislative framework there is still strong, as well as Tanzania. They both have certification program, a digital platform, and they both work on capacity building. However, I have to note here that there is a very big challenge here because it's like the women-owned businesses, it is much higher than the international threshold. It's 70% ownership by women, and the international threshold is usually 51% or more ownership of women. Okay. Barriers, yes, barriers exist, and globally, maybe this slide on barriers talks more on a global level and not only on a specific region, but where the legal framework does not exist or where GRPP is just voluntary and not mandatory, we have a problem here, and it's really very, it cannot be easily adopted. Procurement processes in general are very complex. And this is why when we mentioned that capacity building is key, yes, it is key, because usually it's a long process. The tenders are very often not very clear, and they take a lot of time. And this is like a burden for women to apply for tenders. Limited capacity, and here we're talking about capacity of the women entrepreneurs to apply for tenders and the capacity of procurement officials to integrate women. Sometimes they really are willing and they do want to integrate more women into their supply chain. However, they don't know how to reach them, and when they reach them, they face challenges that they do not know how to counter. Sectoral mismatches, and this is it's in all regions, but specifically in Africa, because women are very often more concentrated in the service sector and the retail sector, and the majority of procurement goes into the construction sector, which is male-dominated, so this is often another barrier. Data gaps, and this is why I mentioned that it's very important when we have a digital platform, digital procurement platform that also collects data, sex-disaggregated data. When there is a data gap, this impedes monitoring and evaluation of the different initiatives. Cultural, أنا خلصت كده? 1 minute. Cultural and structural barriers, which usually face women entrepreneurs, be it access to markets, access to finance, and access to business networks. We already mentioned the best practices, the recommendations. Actually, most of the recommendations I collected also from international organizations who are pushing for the topic. One of them is the political commitment. As we have seen, having a legislative framework has been key in all the countries. So if I need to have a legislative framework, then I need a strong political will. Inclusive stakeholder engagement, meaning that I'm engaging the public sector, the private sector, sorry, I'm engaging civil society so that I'm creating awareness and educating people why GRP is important. Capacity building, we discussed that. Simplified procurement process, strategic planning, and here we mean having a strategic plan for GRP more on a national level that can then be divided into sectoral level. When you have a strategy, you have KPIs and you have people who need to report. Certification systems, as we discussed, it's not easy to identify which businesses women own, data collection, digital platforms, awareness and outreach. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laila. Last but not least, we have Dr. Noura Isa. Dr. Noura is an associate professor of economics at our neighbor's Future University. Dr. Noura received her PhD from Cairo University in economics and her undergraduate and master's degree from AUC, also in economics. Dr. Noura, like everyone, you have 12 minutes.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Okay. Okay. All right, my title is on gender perspectives in climate adaptation and economic resilience in Egypt. Now, this study, the main or the most important research problem was trying to find the intersection between the three terms or concepts that we're using, which are economic resilience, climate adaptation, and gender vulnerability mainly. So the main problems we have, the key challenge is there that we already have existing gender inequalities. And this is very difficult in trying to actually adopt climate adaptation policies, whether they are transformative policies or adaptation policies. And the most important impact on women is that they have a problem with accessing resources, or they have barriers to reach the resources in an unequal way. Okay, so these are the research questions, or what we were assessing. I was assessing, investigating the gender-specific vulnerabilities with regards to the current policies, economic resilience, especially in the face of climate change. We're looking at how climate change would affect the economy in sequential order, and addressing barriers, especially related to climate finance, that would at least try to reduce the effects of climate problems. So this was mainly the conceptual framework, trying to find the overlap or the intersection between the three terms, especially with barriers in women's adaptation, leadership, the climate adaptation strategies, the impact of cultural norms, and economic resilience. This is the methodology that was used. Mainly, it was a qualitative research. There was literature review, case study analysis with regards to different areas in Egypt, especially from 2018 to 2023, policy analysis, especially with related to international organizations, the climate strategy of Egypt of 2050. The interviews, we didn't really have time to do them. I didn't have time to do them, but this was in the plan, and it is very crucial, especially to interview Egyptian women, data synthesis, and then understanding the results. Okay, the findings. I took every and the first part, gender vulnerabilities, and these were the vulnerability areas and the description, and then the examples. So vulnerability areas that were related to gender specific issues, vulnerabilities, mainly the limited access to resources. And this is actually the main economic problem in any economics course. This is what we teach, that the main economic problem is limited resources. So women, especially in Egypt, that are living in agricultural areas or rural areas, are facing barriers with regards to land, financial tools, education, financial inclusion as well. We have, especially in Upper Egypt, for example, high illiteracy rates and limited land ownership for women, for example. Vulnerability area number 2, reliance on climate-sensitive livelihoods, and mainly women in the rural areas in Egypt are dependent, their livelihood is dependent on agriculture. Okay, so women in Nubian villages suffer from soil degradation or soil salinization and water scarcity, which is, so you see the interconnection in the problems. You have a variety of leveling up problems, cultural norms and marginalization, especially with socio-cultural expectations that restrict the domestic tools for women, especially in the decision-making process. For example, limited participation in policy making. This is also, and the leadership roles. Weak healthcare infrastructure, especially in terms of low contraceptive use, or the less awareness in areas. We're looking here at rural areas, and exposure to climate hazards. And here, for example, we have, for example, rising sea levels. Burg Rashid area, women face mobility issues due to infrastructural problems, okay, or submerged infrastructure. So this is another way of looking at it in terms of what we just said. All right, findings number 2, with regards to climate adaptation, we're combining both climate adaptation and economic resilience together. So the strategy area here that we're looking at is the legal framework. And with the legal framework, we're looking at a big emphasis on natural resources and how to use these natural resources in a sustainable way. Especially by looking at the 2014 Egyptian Constitution and Environmental Protection Law. Agricultural adaptation by looking at climate-smart agricultural activities to improve yields and water efficiency. Renewable energy initiatives, okay, such as the solar, wind projects, irrigation systems that would be dependent on solar-powered systems. Community-based projects, using participatory approaches, early warning signs, preparatory methods, preparedness, and all of that, and economic empowerment for women, especially in terms of financial inclusion and financial literacy, especially with the micro and small, medium enterprise and initiatives related to that. All right, this is a summary of what we just said. Proposed policy reforms, I divided the results into reforms, policy reforms, and then policy recommendations. With policy reforms, we have the proposed policy reform, then policy implication, recommendation, and then the example. With the first reform, we want to look at addressing gender-specific vulnerabilities by developing targeted intervention to reduce any socioeconomic barriers, particularly in marginalized communities or rural women living in these areas. How do we do that? By expanding gender-sensitive infrastructure, safe public spaces, transportation, accessible education facilities, to enable women to actually have access to the natural resources and participate in the decision-making process. This could be done by implementing rural development programs, provide training in climate-smart agriculture, access to microfinance, and more initiatives. Strengthening, number 2, national frameworks. We already have the National Climate Change Strategy for 2050, but that needs to be revised because we are living in a dynamic world and we want to include actually very specific and explicit gender responsive goals, such as quotas on how to actually engage women in participatory approaches, adaptation policies, transformative policies, trying to align our national policies with international frameworks, emphasizing capacity building and gender mainstreaming in climate policies. And finally, enhancing access to climate finance, funding subsidized loans to support women-led enterprises, develop community-based financing models, especially for the small-scale renewable energy projects. All right, more proposed reforms. We want to promote women leadership, especially in adaptation strategy, okay? Supporting mentorship, leadership training programs, especially in sectors related to water management, agriculture, waste recycling, urban planning, okay? And force the meaningful participation. Scaling up successful initiatives, the initiatives that we already have, we want to advance them, expand them, expand pilot programs. Do I still have time? Okay, hot. Okay, establish a national database of the best practices, building institutional capacity and fostering international collaborations, multilateral agreements, bilateral agreements is also a part of the link between what we should do and trying to reach sustainable development in that scenario. These are the policy recommendations to wrap up to strengthen gender-responsive legal and policy frameworks by focusing on, and this I believe Dr. Laila mentioned, we want to have access or try to have disaggregated data, gender disaggregated data, implement gender-responsive budgeting by allocating funds to projects benefiting women, supporting women entrepreneurs in sustainable sectors, green economies, the blue economy, capacity building, enhancing accessibility to financial instruments such as low interest loans, easiness, flexibility, gender responsive financial products, or the green finance, which we're looking at now, strengthening community-centric climate adaptation, and fostering innovative climate financing approaches. And I believe these are the future research. I don't have time, right? It's okay. Okay. The future directions or future research focusing on gender inequality and how we can actually quantify it rather than only having qualitative research, exploring how AI and data analytics could actually help us understand the link between economic resilience, climate adaptation, and women vulnerability, accessing scalability of grassroots initiatives, especially in diversifying socioeconomic context, and including vulnerable groups in deeper insights in future research. And study limitations, mainly it was dependent on secondary data. We didn't get the chance to do interviews or surveys. Lack of gender disaggregated climate data. Case studies, we're only looking at Egypt as a geographical location, but this was one of the delimitations and challenges in assessing long-term policy sustainability due to the lack of historical data, because this is actually, yes, okay, that's it.
Thank all speakers for sticking to time. And I'm sorry I've been, pushing everyone to finish at the right time. I would like to open the floor for questions. So we'll take a first round of questions and then we will ask the panelists. So the floor is open to questions for everyone, for all the panelists, I mean. Please, Mohammed.
Sorry. First, very, very nice presentations. Thank you very much. Very, very well done. So the question I have is to Ustadha Layla Al-Mushnib. I wonder why you didn't look at the US. The US has been engaged in women-owned businesses, procurements, at least since the 70s. And the beautiful thing about the US model is that we have 50 different models. So every state has its own model. And they are at different stages of that. Some do none of it, some do a lot of it, some do it as a set aside within the procurement system, some do it as a condition, some do it as a quota, some do it as non-quota, where they specify a certain number. So you have really 50 different models. And there's a lot of, it's basically like experiments. Basically, you've got a lot of experimental and control groups in there that you can do a lot, and you can extract a lot of information from that experience. So I was wondering why you didn't look at that model. Of course, there's also now social equity procurement in the US. There's a lot of research going on social equity procurement, which is happening again in some states, not in all states, but at some level in the federal government, depending on the president. Every president comes in, issues an executive order, and then the other one comes in and writes it off on that end. So, and thank you again.
Thank you, Mohammed. So we have a hand here. The microphone is there. So, and then we have a hand here. Please. There.
My question for Dr. Laila Al-Mushnib as well. I was wondering if the quota system is a solution for the situation here in Egypt. And what if we applied a quota system and then we have, we don't have competent enterprise-led women enterprises applying for public procurement? What do you think?
Thank you. حضرتك اتفضلي.
Thank you, and I would really praise all the papers and the studies. All are good. Thank you for the refugees one. It's a question here. It's not about question, just an idea regarding the public sector conditions for women. Maybe one of the participants mentioned it's a cemetery. The work conditions are really bad. Maybe the conditions are bad for men and women. So we have to differentiate between the bad conditions in general and especially bad conditions or inappropriate conditions for women. I don't know if we need to discuss this together and tell us more about this part, work conditions, because part of my job, like I work on enhancing better women-friendly conditions for women in workplaces. So if the conditions are bad for all of the people or the employees, so it's not fine, but we have to fix this first and then see the impact, or especially on women. Thank you so much. It was impressive. I like it.
Thank you.
The other question, just one small question for Dr. Nouro. How did you find the relation between financial inclusion and climate change? Actually, I'm a financial inclusion senior advisor. So you just came across this quickly, and I want to know, how did you find like a direct relation between both? Thank you so much.
I have Dr. Ibrahim Awad and I have Dr. Ihab Saad, and then we will conclude. And then Dr. Magdi we're actually okay. So 3 questions, and then we give them a chance to answer. Ibrahim, please.
Thank you very much غادة. أنا هتكلم بعد كده مع دكتور نهال عن موضوع اللاجئين وقانون اللجوء وإلى آخره. I have a question for Dr. Rana and Dr. Laila. I guess you talked about the job satisfaction, if I could understand well, in the different administrations. Did you look at how the difference between level of wages, level of income, and the sources of funding of the jobs? For instance, we know that in some ministries, some jobs are funded by international cooperation. So they are better paid, and therefore their attitude to their jobs would be different than jobs paid from the government budget, for instance. So did you find any differences, any clear differences? I guess there are differences, but my question is whether you looked at that. As for the preference for jobs in the public sector, of course, because wages in the public sector are much higher than in the private sector. This is because the private sector is not only the large enterprises, it's the informal economy as well. No. The public sector is not inflated. The size of the public sector is not that big. Now, for Laila, did you Laila المجنب about promotion of procurement from women-led businesses? Would it be useful if there were promotion of procurement from small and medium-sized enterprises? Because women will be more present in women and small and medium-sized enterprises, and therefore you will have promotion from procurement from. So if you go over the board, maybe you will miss women, but women will be more represented there, and therefore if you have promotion, so this is my question to you, whether you think that this could be a way of promoting procurement. And then my other question to you is whether there is also procurement of material that specifically meets the demand of women workers. It's not only that you procure from women-led enterprises, but whether women have special needs in the workplace that could be met with procurement.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Dr. Saad, Professor Saad.
جميعا سؤال إلى الدكتورة ليلى والدكتورة رنم. شكرا على الدراسة المميزة. أنا سؤالي كمان يتعلق بهل حاولت تفهموا لماذا يوجد تباين في الورك براكتس I think سميته البراكتسز بين الوزارات أو الهيئات الحكومية المختلفة، وتحديدا هل جنس الوزير بيلعب دور؟ يعني هل لاحظتوا انه بالوزارات اللي فيها وزير مثلا او وكيل مساعد وكيل وزاره، فكنت مهتم بهذا الجانب انه نحاول نفهم لماذا يوجد تباين بين الهيئات الحكوميه المختلفه. شكرا.
آخر سؤال دكتور مجدي السندي.
Looking at various dimensions of the topic, which is definitely very important. My question to Dr. Laila and Dr. Rana, which is very interesting study, by the way. But I'm just wondering about, did you look at you talking about the what women want, and interesting, quoting the famous movie, Mel Gibson. I'm just wondering about, the changing social contract, because this is the context in which the study is made. And I'm wondering, did you dig a bit into this? I mean, defining how do you see this changing social contract? What are the criteria? What are the dimensions? And in the meantime, looking also on what are on the ground in terms of realities, because this is a kind of perception studies. You're looking at what do they perceive, but what about the realities? Do you see any kind of changing in more gender aware, gender sensitive policies or practices happening? Looking at the cabinet that has been, including over the past 10 years, more women taking, yeah, okay. These kind of elements, so that in HR policies, so that you compare or you put the perceptions in the context of other elements in reality. That's a question which was not clear to me in this study.
Thank you, everyone. If you have more questions, we have the dinner. Let me start by order of questions. So maybe the first questions were directed to Laila Al-Mushnib, and then I think Dr. Laila and Rana, and then Dr. Noura, and I think Dr. Ibrahim هيتكلم معاكي لوحده. Please answer all your questions at once. على طول.
Very quickly, regarding the US model, I agree with you. It's very interesting to look at the US model. However, let me mention something. It was honestly very difficult at the beginning to decide on which countries and which regions to undertake the study. For example, in Africa, there are more, it's not only Kenya and Tanzania, there are a lot of African countries who are working on that. However, I had to be very concise and precise on which countries I use. Otherwise, it would have been like a huge document. Regarding the states, yes, it is interesting, but it would have, as you mentioned, the approach is very diverse and it's very different. I would have, at this instance, I would have taken the states and rather than any other region. So I opted to taking different regions. And the reason for that is that I wanted to know how GRP works in different socioeconomic contexts. Latin America, they're doing great compared to any other region. They're doing great in this area. We have Chile. Chile, they have 45% of public procurement going to women and like 60% going to women in rural areas as well. So the experience in Latin America has been really very impressive. That's for the first question. I think that's it. Regarding the question on the quota system, actually, one of the things that I mentioned in the paper is that before deciding if you will go for gender responsive procurement or not, countries have competing agendas and they have competing socioeconomic objectives. So before embarking on this initiative, you have to assess, is gender responsive public procurement the answer to your specific country to promote for the economic empowerment of women or not? After you do the assessment, you have to decide on which mechanism you will adopt, because countries do many things. Some use the preferential procurement, some just they put additional evaluation points are awarded to companies that are owned or led by women or are gender responsive. So it has to be like a comprehensive process and not just to decide is the quota system right or wrong. Additionally, you need to have a strong legislative system. You cannot just go in and say, I'm putting a quota. No, you have it. You have to have it there in the legislation so that it is mandatory and it is not up to each organization. I hope this answered your question. Dr. Ibrahim, you are right on the point of SMEs, and but let me tell you something. For example, in the Dominican Republic, they do have like 15% of the procurement budget dedicated to SMEs. However, they keep from this 15%, like 20%, yes, 20% that go to women who lead SMEs. And the reason for that is that women face a lot of difficulties as entrepreneurs. If you just open it up to SMEs, it will still be unfair competition because men have, or like enterprises that are not women-led, let's not be very specific, that are not women-led, they don't have the same barriers. Women have the barrier to access finance as a woman entrepreneur. They have barriers even to understand the procurement processes. So I think, yes, having a percentage of procurement dedicated to SMEs, it's a great thing. However, we still, at least at this point, we need to still start by keeping a percentage to the women. I'm not sure I got the question about the special needs of women at the workplace. However, let me go back to when I initially started, and I mentioned that the definition that I choose for GRP is women-led businesses, women-owned businesses, and gender-responsive enterprises. And the reason that I opt for this very broad definition, which is the UN Women-led ILO definition, is because you have you increase the impact across the value chain. So it's not only women owners of business, but any business that supports the gender agenda would be eligible to GRP. I'm not sure if this is the question or this is the answer. We can discuss over lunch.
Dr. Laila.
As much as I remember, the public service, in our opinion, is still inflated and overstaffed because they employ people who do not really have any kind of real job to do. And the numbers are above the needs of the work organizations. So this is one point. The other point, yes, maybe compared to the informal sector, they are better paid than the private informal sector, but the payment they get does not meet their basic needs sometimes. So this is a challenge, and this is what they were talking about. And it's getting more serious with the devaluation, the repeated rounds of devaluation. The other question was about the differences, the challenges faced by men and women. Sometimes they are the same, yes, but we were giving a voice to the women in public service. Some of the challenges are only felt by women, like the insensitive workplaces. They don't have a designated toilet, for example, to use, and the harassment that they face. So men are not complaining about these issues, but definitely they are suffering also from the relatively low compensation, and more when men are quitting the public service, according to the qualitative study we did, compared to women. So women go on leave, they go on childcare leave. The men decide to move to the private sector whenever an opportunity arises. The differences in human resources management practices amongst different government organizations goes back to the type of organization. So there is the traditional bureaucracy, using maybe similar human resources management tools and practices. And there are these newer agencies that are developing in Egypt for specific purposes, and they have different pay scales, different allowances, different bonuses, different levels of flexibility in managing the workforce. So that's why there are differences. And then the informal arrangements with the staff, like in the think tank that's led by a government organization, and they use 3 months contract. This is not registered or written about anywhere. And we're trying to link perceptions with reality. So we're checking what are the laws applicable, what are the changes that have been taking place over time. Definitely the social contract has changed. In the 60s, everyone got to be employed in government. They really appreciated the compensation they were getting and the privileges they were getting. And there was very little space for job opportunities, maybe in the private sector. This is no longer the case. The government is no longer appointing people. And when appointing, it's short-term contracts and less privileges. And again, going back to the point that it's overstaffed, the government does not know how many people work in its bureaucracy. And this is according to Dr. Saleh al-Sheikh. The last census they did, they reached the 3.5 million employees, and they did not continue, while President al-Sisi is talking about 7 million. So it's a vague issue. And this is a huge problem affecting both men and women, definitely.
Thank you, Dr. Laila. And last, do you want to add something? We're beyond time, and I have to give you certificates. So one
No,
last
very
thing.
quickly, one last point,
One
because
last
Dr.
point.
Laila, she answered most of the questions. So our sample was a purposive sample, mostly educated women, highly educated, mostly with, university or even master degrees. So yeah, they had this choice of moving to the private sector with higher compensation, financial compensation, but they choose to stay in the public sector, mainly for the benefits or for the learning curve. So the inverted U learning curve and the prestige that comes with it. Just to answer, maybe that's part of Dr. Ibrahim's question. So we didn't have that many women who wouldn't find an opportunity in the private sector, right? So they could easily move to the work in international organizations or the private sector, but they choose to stay until they reach that stage where they feel they are not learning anymore. And here some of them started thinking about maybe very soon we'll start looking for a job in the private. But other than that, they prefer to still stay.
Dr. Noor, I have 20 seconds.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. But the answer to your question is that when we look at economic resilience, we're looking at having an economy that is lenient and flexible, especially when we have a crisis, especially climate change or any hazards. So with resilience, we're looking at the SDGs involved or the sustainable reforms involved, such as climate adaptation policies and structural reform. In that sense, climate adaptation, part of it is actually gaining access to climate finance from governments and international initiatives. If you do not have financial inclusion, which is actually gaining access to either ownership of a credit card, an open account, or whatever, how can you access these funds and how can you gain economic resilience? Because with resilience, you have the pre-crisis, during, and post, and you need to be well prepared with the right actions and finance, such as crops, infrastructure, if we're looking at the rural area to do that. I have a paper on financial inclusion, by the way. Yeah.
I want to thank everyone, as the tradition goes, and we get the photographer last by order. We start by the first presenter, Dr. Nihal Hashim. Thank you very much. I'll give you this. Harder. Okay. Thank you. Next, we have Dr. Rana Hindi. And Dr. Laila. And we have next Laila Al-Mushnib. And last but not least, we have Dr. Noura. Thank you, everyone. I think we have to run to the main room, to the Mu'taz Al-Alfi, for the wrapping session. And there is a dinner and a singer. مين المغني؟
خلينا نجيب ناس مبتدئة.